context here. Jesus. Historical context here in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a very, very, very interesting place because it is kind of the crossroads of a lot of the East and the West. It was located in the middle of the Silk Road for a really long time. For those of you that don't know, the Silk Road was basically the road that European traders and Asian traders would kind of cross through to trade to each other's countries. So like European traders would come to Asia to collect Asian goods and trade away some of the goods from Europe, and then vice versa. So Asian traders would cross the Silk Road to go to Asia, or to go to Europe, and trade away their goods and their natural resources that they had there. So Afghanistan is kind of caught in the middle of that, and it's filled with natural resources. I mean, there's so much various precious metals. I believe the number one opium producer in the world. Just a lot of things. They have a lot. It's that whole region of South Asia has been so highly coveted throughout history because of the fact that it's so it's filled with just constant what's it called? It's filled with constant natural resources. I mean, you look at India, you look at Pakistan, you look at Afghanistan, you look at Bangladesh. They're all filled with natural resources. And you look at everybody. I mean, the British were like, "Yep, we're going there to colonize them," and they did. I mean, the British colonized India for a long time, and India was a lot bigger when the British colonized it. For those of you that don't know, so India basically swallowed up Pakistan and parts of Afghanistan as well, and the British basically had control for a while. Obviously, 1947, they left. And I know more of the recent history of Afghanistan rather than the past, but I know there was a lot of splits colonialism essentially caused a lot of the problems that we're seeing today. That's a fact. And it's crazy to think that if colonialism hadn't happened, there would be so much different. And maybe there would have been less hatred. We look at it more differently. We look at South Asia as just very differently than we do without colonialism existing. But colonialism happened. The British and the French, I believe, split up the Middle East really badly. Afghanistan was basically caught in the middle of that. Then Russia, and this is where I kind of know. So Russia basically was threatened or really wanted the territory of Afghanistan because they didn't want the United States to gain control of that territory. So they gained control of Afghanistan, and there was a big war in which the CIA, and this was in the 70s. So this was during the Cold War, peak of the Cold War. So this was basically what happened was during the peak of the Cold War, Afghanistan was controlled by Russia, and America, and Russia were obviously feuding and beefing. And so America was basically like, F this, like we're going to we're going to fight the war, but we're not actually going to fight the war. So what they did was they basically had the CIA fund these rebels in Afghanistan who were fighting against the Russians. And so those rebels became known as the Mujahideen. For those of you that don't know, the Mujahideen eventually contained people such as Osama bin Laden, and part of the Mujahideen turned into the Taliban. So basically, in all entirety, the United States caused modern day terrorism. The United States was responsible for its own fate in some instance. Okay, I'm sure I'm oversimplifying it, but there's a lot of different other aspects that caused, the 9/11 and the various terrorist attacks that happened. But the United States did fund the Mujahideen and gave them that initial push to basically kick Russia out of Afghanistan. Afghanistan becomes independent, and then go through the 90s. Basically, there's no real democratic framework or any foundation. There is no possible way that Afghanistan can set up a legit government without any Western power to help them. So it basically turns into an all-out civil war for different tribal militias to basically gain control of the country. Eventually, it leads to what does it lead to? Eventually, it leads to eventually it leads to the Taliban gaining a lot of traction and power, and they basically take control of the entire country by 1996. And at that point, you're basically looking at a terrorist run state. In that, what I'm saying is basically a terrorist organization was in charge of the government. They instituted all their crazy laws. Like, what was it? They basically instituted stoning. They basically brought back stoning, which is like an ancient punishment for adultery. Basically gave women no rights, said women couldn't go to school. And this was at this point that I believe the Taliban controlled about 95% of Afghanistan. There's a little corner, which I'll talk about. And the Taliban basically instituted Sharia law, which is like the very strict fundamentalist Islamic law, into the country. And it made it just very not a good place for women and children, I believe, in particular, to live, and really anybody, because, uh, it's a very militaristic type of law, and there's not like music wasn't allowed, and culture basically was just limited to like praying and very very strict and regimented schedules, when in reality Afghanistan had always been this free culture. You read The Kite Runner, you read A Thousand Splendid Suns, a lot of these books, they talk about how Kabul was this really just beautiful free international city in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, 70s, where there was a lot of people from all over the world that would gather, the cafes in the street. It was like a free city. It was very safe. It was beautiful. Beautiful architecture. Just a lot of like, you hear these stories and you're like, and you compare it to what you've heard about Afghanistan, particularly for my whole life, because I mean, the year I was born, like literally a year after I was born, the United States invaded Afghanistan. So all I've known Afghanistan as is war torn, Taliban, terrorism. Like that's what we've known Afghanistan as. But I mean, you look at the early 1900s of the 20th century, Afghanistan was this beautiful place where there's so much culture. There was so much openness. It was a very liberal culture, very progressive. And there was this tiny little corner of Afghanistan in the 90s that the Taliban couldn't take over because it was headed by this guy by the name of Ahmad Shah Massoud. And Ahmad Shah Massoud was this general who was basically trying to advocate for a more liberal Afghanistan, a democratic Afghanistan where women had rights and, just kind of more similar to a democratic model of the United States. And he was basically confined to this one corner of Afghanistan. And it was basically like trying to bring back Kabul to what it was in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s before all the war really hit again, because there was this free period of enlightenment, so to speak, in Kabul. And a lot of Middle Eastern cities before wars tended to hit them kind of in the 80s and the 90s. And the Ahmad Shah Massoud was basically like, he had no help. No Western powers wanted to help him fight the Taliban in Afghanistan. And he tried and he begged and he pleaded to the UN and no one really helped him. They sent like a few troops, but they called themselves the Northern Alliance, but they could not match up against the Taliban. And there was no way that he could possibly do anything. But Ahmad Shah Massoud, again, like tried, and, he would gain little bits of ground, but not anything of significance. The Taliban controlled most of the country. So fast forward a little bit to 2001. Ahmad Shah Massoud basically, I think this was like May or June, he goes to a UN conference in Brussels and he basically warns the, what's it called? He basically warns the UN and says, guys, there is a huge terrorist attack that bin Laden and obviously Al Qaeda had become a big thing at that point, and they were in Afghanistan at the time, and they were basically and like the Taliban had people like from Pakistan coming into Afghanistan, like it was a whole like terror run state, and he was basically warning them like there's a huge terrorist attack that's about to hit the United States sometime this year. I don't know when, and I don't know the exact details, but there's a huge terrorist attack that's going to hit the United States. You guys have to help me. And suddenly, the government started listening of the world, and they started sending more troops, and Ahmad Shah Massoud was finally being taken seriously. And 3 days before, I think it was 2 or 3 days before 9/11, he was giving a news conference, and two Al Qaeda individuals were disguised as journalists, and they basically let off a suicide bomb, and he was killed. And that was the leader of Afghanistan. That was one of the leaders for a democratic version of Afghanistan. Obviously, 2 days later, 9/11 happens. George W. Bush announces we're going to Afghanistan. You guys know the rest of the story. Okay, we're here now. And so that was kind of the historical context that I wanted to give through the 80s and the 90s, because I feel like that's lost in this process when we talk about Afghanistan, and when we talk about the whole world is, or when we talk about Afghanistan, I feel like we're prisoners of the moment right now, where we're talking about the current Taliban takeover. But this is years and years and years of built up tension of various historical events. And I, gave you the highlights. You could obviously do way more research and tell me more. And there's so much more research to have been done for this, but I thought I did the best job that I possibly could.